Japan and from Tsukuba University, and I'm really happy to take the lecture for the South in the Pre-ABP. So the theme for the trade lecture is about advanced BP judging, and I will especially focus on how we evaluate the argument, how we assess the arguments. So as for the question, if you have any question, you can raise your hand or you can drop on the chat. I will also take the time to the Q&A session after the lecture. So if you have any question, you can ask there. So let's begin. So for the contents, I'll just briefly catch the general BP judging and then mainly talking about how we understand the argument. Then moving on to the how we, about the derivation and OAs. So as for the general BP judging, so like BP judging is basically judged based on the contribution, based on the contribution. So the difference between AP and BP is that AP are direct construction and deconstruction from each team, which means that not only pure evaluation of the argument, but holistic evaluation including refutations. So if opposition side refute government side, then that means that gov argument are discredited by the refutation from opposition. But the difference between the BP is that BP is not it's not like a deconstruction, but evaluated through or evaluated as a contribution. For example, how well it proven. So for example, if CZ refute opening opposition, it counts as credit for CZ and not discredit for the opening opposition. This is basically making fair for the opening team because they have less opportunity to directly refute to the closing team. So this is the kind of general understanding for the BP judging. For the BP judging. Then the second thing is about assessment of the refutations. As I touched, that the BP is about the refutation will be counted as a credit for that team and not discredit. So I think there is several ways we have to assess the refutations. The first thing I want to note is about the counter analysis, because I think there is some rounds or some rounds has a common problem of teams provided just different scenarios or characterization or phrase, etc. So for example, on the motion, this house will allow the use of performance enhancing drug in the professional sports. Probably government side will argue that players are forced to intake drugs because coach want players win, which result in better reputation and salary for the coaches themselves. Probably opposition argue the player would not forced because coaches care about their health. They cherish players, spending time with them like practice and conversation. That's why they don't make the course. They don't force them to take the drug. I think that although both teams try to provide the characterization on, the coaches will care about player or not care about player and result in coerced choice or not coerced choice. I think this is something that parallel in the characterization, and this is not direct refutation on direct negation of not directly negate the mechanization or characterization provided from each team, which I think the common problem or the common situation we can see in this in the rounds. In that instances, like how we adjudicate refutation is that being concise about the effectiveness of the refutation. So I think there is effective or ineffective refutation. So as I said in the first thing, as a common problem, there is parallel in the characterization or scenarios in the refutation. Probably this is not that effective refutation as it cannot directly challenge the mechanization coming from them. So it's just suggesting different scenario, which ended up unclear which scenario is more likely, etc. So, but if there is, so what is the effective response? Is that challenge the unproven assumption from that team. For example, what government side, what opposition side can do to prove why players won't be coerced by the coaches. The way they can challenge is that even if coaches course force players to intake drugs, it not result in having good reputation because harming players' body oftentimes unpopular, or nobody hires coaches which against the interest of athletes. At least it is not a good deal. I think these responses challenge the unproven assumption of the what government had, like generating the results by having the drug leads to the better reputation, and this logical link onto why it leads, whether or not it leads to the good reputation was challenged by the opposition side. So I think this type of the reputation can be the effective response, or the another way is that so for example, ban on drug gonna be the solution to prevent coaches to pressurize players to do more, or pressurize players to take the drugs. So probably the way of opposition side can counter is that if coaches incentive is so bad, then it won't be changed in either world. For example, they may ask them to take drug anyways, or impose very severe training, etc. So I think this is gonna be the effectiveness in the this is gonna be the effective refutation, which challenges the unproven assumption. And I think to distinguish this effectiveness of the refutation is important, because if you credit different just in different scenario and not the direct one, probably it seems unfair for the one team, like why the judges prioritize one scenario over the other. So you can put the more importance on these direct type of the refutation or effective type of refutation. I think this is the one way to assess the refutation in a good way. Then, when it comes to the judge the effectiveness of the refutation, I think there are several things. The first thing is that to what extent they prove the refutation. I think this is gonna be the similar as evaluation for a constructive argument, because like refutation at the end of the debate, at the end of the day, requires to have the mechanization, logics, or illustration, and like whatever. So I will just explain. You can just imagine like this will same thing will apply to the refutation as well when I explain about the understanding argument. The second thing is that whether it fully represents opponent's arguments, because I think in the rounds sometimes teams misrepresent arguments and then refute to a bit different way that's the original team intended to do. So in that instances, refutation might not be critical enough, as it deviate from the framing or deviate from the intention teams have. So in that instances, I think this is going to be a bit less effective refutation. The sad thing is that how this interact with arguments. So I think there's a type of challenges that refutation has. For example, challenge for exclusivity, challenge for impact, challenge for relevance to the motion, etc. In that instances, you can so if you credit the response, when teams intend to refute to the exclusivity, but you credit in a way a challenge to the impact, that means that probably teams thought that that response is not properly credited by the judges, properly interpreted by the judges, which seems like not fair, or seems like a bit deviate from the intention. That's why I think it's also important to acknowledge how each refutation is interact with where and what is the intention that teams have. So these are the assessment of a refutation, especially in the BP judging. And I think this is the general in general how we see the BP judging. I think this is gonna be a bit basic thing. Then the main thing is that understanding arguments. I think that because I think the common things or common struggle as a judge is that difficult to difficult to fairly judge to what extent that argument are proven. I think these are the things that people oftentimes go as a struggles to fairly judge. So the as a general note, there is to note. The first thing is that argument will be proven via combination of logic and intuition. So it's not sufficient to just giving the logic or just giving the intuition, because even if it is logically true, probably some judges or some people feel like it is unintuitive if there is no example, and vice versa. Even if there is multiple intuition, it can be vulnerable to the logical explanation. So the combination of logic and intuition is important to prove the argument, and it's also important for judges to acknowledge that both combinations are important. The second note is that there is two layers of evaluation for the argument. The first thing is that how should we evaluate claim as a whole, taking into account the degree to which it demonstrates logic and intuition. So it's kind of quality of the substantive the team provided. The second thing is that how we evaluate relevance to the motion based on the degree of the proof. So it basically means, for example, if the motion by the consequence of the argument or level of proof of the argument, it's sufficient, for example, if the motion should be affirmed or not, or to determine who wins or loses. So not only just evaluating the argument itself, but there should be the consequence on how it interact with the win or loss, or how it will interact with the affirm or negate for the motion. So this is the two layers of the evaluation which we needed to consider when we needed to consider to judge the argument. So I think in the argument, when the teams prove the argument, there's several perspectives we have to take in account. I just want to touch 5 parts in my lecture. The first thing is about the likelihood. Second thing is about exclusivity. And third thing is about impact. First thing is about weighing, and lastly about the intention. And when we judge and when we evaluate the argument, it is important to note that to what extent each perspective or each criteria are proven by the teams. Because even if the teams are very good at proving the likelihood, if they are bad at impacting, probably it cannot be the strongest argument the teams provided. Vice versa, even if teams are very good at proving the impacting, if they are not able to show the exclusivity, this doesn't come to the conclusion that this impact will come by this motion. So these interactions are very important, but it is difficult to judge, in an integrated manner. So we have to see, like, in the each criteria, to what extent each burden or each perspective were explained from the speaker or from the teams. That's why I will explain from now how these evaluation or criteria can be assessed in the round. And then I will just provide 5 level of proof to each criteria. So the first criteria or first perspective is about the likelihood. Like whether or not that harm or benefit will happen. I think there is a 5 level. There's like basically 5 level of proof in the likelihood. The first thing is there is no plausible explanation or no decent characterization, and just giving convenient cases and scenarios. Probably this cannot prove how likely the scenario is, but the last level, like the highest level, is, for example, carefully demonstrate the likelihood based on comparison with other scenarios, characterization, etc. And then if they are able to explain, these demonstrations are fully proven, they reasonably explain, then they can show how likely this is, even if they acknowledge sometimes of different scenario or characterization, still their scenario is majority. So these are the gradation in the how the likelihood is proven how the likelihood is proven in the argument. So let's take the example. The example can be like, for example, parents will teach conservative value to the children, and then children will be the conservative. Let's see this, assertion. The first level is that, for example, the only explanation is parents will teach the conservative ideology to the children. This doesn't explain how likely this is, what kind of explanation parents made, why parents are likely to teach conservative value to the children, etc. So there is no plausible explanation, and it's unclear on how likely this scenario happen. Then the second level is kind of getting some sense, and it seems like something that could happen based on the illustration, but there is no explanation on likelihood or probability. So in the same example, probably the way team explain, like parents were likely to explain with girls should be submissive, girls should not be assertive, boys should be strong, etc. These type of conservative value are taught by parents to the children. I think this type of illustration on how the exactly message looks like is something that somewhat understandable and somewhat likely to happen, but there's no concrete explanation on how it is likely or how it is likely. So these are the kind of second level of explanation. The third level is the some or brief explanation of the logic behind why this is true. So, in the example is that parents will think the conservative ideology is something important and beneficial. That's why children, that's why parents teach conservative ideology to the children, stuff like that. So, I think there is explanation on what kind of thinking that parents have, which leads to the behavior of the parents. But still, there is no enough explanation on why parents think the conservative ideology is something important or the beneficial. That is something that's that is still like the explanation is insufficient and belief, but some level of logic exists. This is like third level. The first level is that detailed logic and analysis that can be considered correct. The example is parents are also taught the conservative ideology is very important and very important from a younger age, and they are surrounded by these people who have similar ideology. They consume the conservative medias as well, and then they believe in the conservative ideology, especially talking about when parents is child, like the parents' childhood is also more conservative than current situation, etc. So in that instances, I think that I think this explanation shows why parents put importance on the conservative ideology to be important, and how they magnify that belief through their life. That shows that parents are likely to have the conservative value, and then they also try to teach to the children because they think it is important and beneficial. This explains there is a detailed logic on the process of thinking of a parent and the process of behavior the parents will take, which has the more detailed explanation compared to like other three level. The last level is that carefully demonstrate the likelihood based on the comparison with other scenarios, characterization, etc. The example gonna be, giving the explanation on, adding the explanation of even if case, even if the parents consume liberal media, and parents, even if parents are not actively teach that conservative ideology that much, parents probably think it is much easier or much safer to raise in the conservative ideology due to the survivalship bias, etc. So this basically compares why the influence of liberal narrative or even if there is a scenario of the moderate, the parents are moderately taught in the conservative ideology, still they are able to show the parents likely to believe in the conservative ideology more and then teach conservative value more compared to the other ideology. So I think this can compare with the likelihood of, still able to show that this scenario of teaching conservative value is likely based on comparison of other scenarios of characterization. So this shows how likely this will happen, even though there is some inferences. So these are the gradation in the level of proof of the likelihood. And then it's also like affected the speaker score as well. But I think this type of like how much they're able to show it is a bit easier for judges to understand how much they're able to show the likelihood of the scenario happening, because I think that this will also apply to the other criteria. But I think the oftentimes judge will, judging is kind of gradation and spectrum and not black and white, like whether or not they prove or not. This is like something different. And I think the judging is more like to what extent that they're able to prove. So it is important to have the perspective of the gradation in each, for example, likelihood or exclusivity. uh this is something we have to acknowledge. And then these criteria or these rebel can, makes it easier makes it easier to understand how we should evaluate the argument. So next thing is about exclusivity. This is also basically similar to what I said in the likelihood. The lowest level is no explanation as to why this is exclusive or argument seems symmetric. The highest level is explanation carefully capture the differences and characteristics of both world, or goes so far as to address other scenarios, for example, disprove alternatives. Uh yeah, I think it's easy to take the example again. So for example, let's take the example of uh people will spend healthy life or healthy lifestyles by imposing fat tax. So the first level is that uh, the teams don't explain about the solution, like what is the solution, and also they have the assumption on the tax automatically means that less consumption of the fat tax, and then it automatically connect to the people's life gonna be more healthier. But I think there should be explanation on, for example, why why taxation de-incentivize people to consume fat food, etc. So I think that these no explanation for the solution or no explanation on the assumption that they have, linkage to the one phenomenon to the other phenomenon, is something no explanation on how exclusive it is. That's why how exclusive it is, and then this is going to be the lowest level of explanation. The second level explanation is a kind of getting some sense, and it seems to be unlikely to happen in the comparative based on the illustration. It's kind of like explaining people tend to avoid the expensive food or expensive meals, etc. So these type of level of explanation. So it is intuitively understandable that people will avoid expensive one, but still it's not that sufficient. Why this feeling of avoiding expensive meals is the very important factor, or contribute a lot to show that there is a meaningful difference in each world. So the third level is that some or belief explanation of the long logic behind why this is exclusive. So in addition to the explanation on second level, for example, the teams will explain, spending for food is very daily life expenses. So it's accumulate over time. So in order to spend other expenditure, for example, the money for hobby or educational fee, they try to suppress, they try to minimize the expense for the fat food, which will be the expensive by the tax. Then this incentive to save the money will lead to less consumption of the taxes, less consumption of fat food. I think this can explain the logic on how people think and why this process of thinking leads to the behavioral change of people. I think this is some explanation happen, but I think that still like it is missing on the how the status, like people behave and think in the status quo, which have the less explanation on the degree of the change or degree of exclusivity by this explanation. So the first level is that detailed logic and analysis that can be considered exclusive, and this is the example is, in addition to the second level explanation, third level explanation, they can additionally argue that in the status quo, fat food is very cheap. And then, because it is cheap, affordable for now, that's why the incentive control by taxation is something effective. So, also, the imposement of tax, this perception itself, this fact itself, normatively discourage people to consume the fat food. I think these type of explanation are more detailed compared to the third level explanation, because if the fat food is already so expensive, then probably people don't consume anyways. Or if the fat food is very if the tax cannot be the tipping point, probably is not enough to explain, fat food is going to be expensive. So it is important to show how this tax can be the tipping point to change the people's behavior. And then the way of explanation is probably the status quo, the fat food is very cheap. That's why, like, by the taxation, it's changed the people's perception. It changed the it changed the feeling of the people, which leads to these behavioral changes. So these are the more detailed explanation on how this gonna be exclusive. The last thing is that explanation carefully captures the difference and characteristic of both worlds, or goes so far as to address other scenarios, for example, disproving the alternatives. The example is that in addition to the fourth level, they will explain even if the fat food is gonna be expensive, even though the fat food will be expensive, still like there is other way of low fat food that is accessible, that can be energetic for the people. And also, even if the calorie, or the intake is not sufficient it is still better for the people who are taking a lot in status quo. So this basically explains why the tax is only way to change the situation, or it's also explain why the problem is something that exclusively happen by the situation, like status quo or without the taxes. I think this type of explanation, citing the alternative or citing the different scenario, and then showing how still why this is exclusive scenario, is the fifth level or at highest level on in proving the exclusivity. So it's kind of comparison between other scenarios, and like comparison between other scenario and showing how alternative not works. So this is the explanation on likelihood and exclusivity. moving on to the impacting. The lowest level is no idea why this is important or no attempt to explain it. The highest level is magnify and extend the impact, proving multi-layered explanation. So let's take the example of the impact of the environmental destruction or environmental pollution going to be happen in the developing country. Let's take this example. The lowest level explanation on why no idea why this is important or no attempt to explain it is, for example, they ended up explaining environment will be destroyed. That's it. Or they aren't able to explain what will be infringed or what will be harmed, who and how they will suffer. These type of explanation lacked. Then it's difficult to understand how it is important, how it looks like. So these are the lowest level of explanation. The second thing is that belief illustration that tells somewhat important. So for example, the water pollution, air pollution are happen, desertification happen. These type of a bit more concrete explanation on what is actually likely to happen. But still, it's intuitively bad. Intuitively, like sounds bad, but it doesn't explain to the extent how it actually destroys people or who will likely to suffer in what way. I think these type of more concrete, more detailed explanation are lacked by this brief illustration. So these are the kind of like second level explanation. The third thing is that explanation through a certain level of description or a bit of logic. So the example is that air pollution or water pollution leads to the health problem. Desertification deprives people to do farm. Desertification deprives people of the place of farming or place to live. I think these type of explanation are more clear in explaining who will suffer in what way. I think these are the more specificity in the impacting, more explanation on the process of happening. So I think this explanation gives the certain level of description which makes it understandable how important this impact is. So this is the third level. The first level is concrete description and detailed logic. So for example, the pollution leads to the cancer, that leads to the severe health problem. Desertification deprives of the farming place or living place, and then it results in like they'll also financially suffer by deprivation. So this type of like more detailed explanation on how process looks like, what is the realistic impacting likely to happen, this type of the actual depiction, like how people are, to the extent people are able to imagine same page or same illustration, is the complete description and detailed logic that count as the fourth level of impacting. The last level, the highest level, is magnify and extend the impact, providing a multi-layered explanation. So the multi-layered explanation is something that's not giving like this, and this. It's like multi-layered explanation is like giving several type of explanation, several type of impact, which seems also important. So for example, having having the health problem, for example, severe health problem like cancer, which also deprives of the opportunity of education or working, because they have to be absent on that time when they are taking treatment. They also, which also pressurized financially because they have to pay expensive amount of medical fees, medical fees in addition to their living life. And probably the medicine, hospitals are also occupied so much by increase of the patient. This is also bad for the hospital or regional medics. I think this explanation on not only just saying one people will suffer, but giving an example on the one people will suffer in several ways, or not by the person but also society, or society or region will also likely to suffer. I think these are the multi-layered explanation on how they are likely to suffer. It's also it's also important to have the logic and illustration on how this impact are likely to happen. But I think these multi-layered explanation are able to give how severe this impact is. So this is the highest level of proof on impacting. The next thing is about the weighing. The lowest level is that no attempt to compare. The highest level is that the importance of a criterion is explained in terms of, for example, intuition, logic, and a meta perspective, and sufficiently demonstrate how they're winning in that criteria. So let's firstly talk about let's also talk in having the example. So the example will comparison between which is more important, environment or economy for developing country. Let's take this example. The lowest level is just asserting environment is important or economy is important, and there is no explanation on in what metric environment or economy is important, how there is no attempt to compare which is more important in what metric. This is no attempt to compare the lowest level of proof in terms of weighing. The second level is that only a vague set of criteria is presented, and the importance of that perspective is not explained, and or it is unclear how it is advantageous in that class. So, the example is when they try to explain the environmental destruction. The victim of environmental destruction is more vulnerable. I think these are the vague criteria provided, but there is no explanation on why the people who suffer from economy is not more vulnerable compared to the one who suffer from environment. The another thing is the another way that is explaining the environmental destruction is irreversible, that's bad. But it's also unclear why irreversibility is important, whether or not this criteria is exclusive. So these are the just a vague set of criteria, and there is no detailed explanation on why they are, how they are superior or prior in that metric, or why the metric itself is something important or exclusive. The third level is that implicit weighing is presented and possible to credit it. So for example, in addition to the second level explanation, the third level is like explaining the environmental destruction is particularly particularly affect to the people who are dependent on the lands or the natural resources, especially talking about the people who live in rural area, which leads to the big harm for them. Economy will recover in like several years to like several decades, but the forest or natural resources take far more time. These are the implicit weighing coming out. These are the implicit weighing, and it can be creditable. How creditable how this how they try to take advantage in that metric. The first level is that the importance of a criterion is explained to a certain extent, and it is unclear how they are winning in that criteria. So the way, for example, the regional area or rural area that people who depend on the lands and natural resources are living is more politically and economically vulnerable. That's why the severity of the impact gonna be more serious, likely to be serious or easy to get serious. And economical loss can recovered through the support from, like, for example, like the multinational corporation or like the international organization like NGOs or other support from other country. So the economical harm can gradually recovered, but air pollution or air pollution, the water pollution, or the land resources forests that already lost won't be come back. That's why this is how the irreversibility happen, things like that. So these type of explanation are able to suggest why that metric is something important, and then they're also able to suggest how they are winning in that metric, not only giving like explanation. So they are comparing in that metric, like for example, like in terms of irreversibility, that they are able to explain level of reversibility is different between economy and environment. These are the comparison within that criteria, and then they are able to show how they're winning in that criteria, and this is the fourth level. The fifth level is that, the highest level is that uh they're giving the importance of criterion is explained in terms of intuition, logic, and meta perspective, and sufficiently demonstrate how they're winning in that criteria. The example is that, for example, government should focus on more long-term impact, cross generation impact, for this, like several reasons, or they can also explain how the environmental destruction can also impactful to the opponent, what the demographic opponent try to protecting. So the environmental destruction is something that holistically important, etc. So they are able to by these explanation, what they did is that explaining how logically the long term how logically you know prior giving putting importance on that criteria is something important, or they can able to explain in the meta perspective not only your actor, but this criteria or this type of explanation can also protect the actors who opponent want to protect this as well. So these meta perspective are inserted when they are comparing in the weighing. They can bring the judge's perspective to persuade judges how this impact or how this logic is more prior, more important than what that of opponent. So these are the different, these are the gradation in the weighing. So all I explained is about the likelihood, exclusivity, impact, and weighing. So what is important is because there is several arguments or several way of evaluation in BP judging. There's so many teams, and it is very difficult to sort everything in the rounds and then go to the deliberation with a clear sense. So that's why I think this having a level of understanding or having the understanding on gradation in impact is very important, because you can just sort this like it's more easy for you to sort how teams prove their argument. For example, opening government are good at proving likelihood. They are like fifth level, but third level on exclusivity. The opening opposition are not really good at likelihood. They're fourth level, but they're very good at impacting their fifth level. So you can just hold your, you can just clear your thought. For example, opening government are winning in the likelihood, but opening opposition are winning in the impacting. So what we have to do here is that how we compare the likelihood and impacting, which also I think contribute in the deliberation. So probably some judge will put more importance on likelihood, some judge will put importance on the impacting. So you're more clear on what is the clash or what is the most contentious part that you have to discuss in the deliberation. So this is something that's necessary or makes it easy to sort, clear your thoughts, and then that is how these type of like likelihood, exclusivity, impact weighing, and having the understanding the gradation in each explanation is important. That is something that's understanding arguments, which leads to the better judging, better understanding on the rounds. So last thing I want to say is that about intention that debaters have, because I think the some common problem or common feedback judges will get is that this judge is self-inserting, or this judge is more charitable to one team, stuff like that. So the reason why these happen is because I think that's the partly because the judge is deviate from the intention that debaters have. So it is also important to judge these likelihood, exclusivity, impact, and weighing in a way that debater won't judges to understand, won't judges to credit. So we have to acknowledge how the intention of debaters broad, and then we have to judge in that framework. But also there is some several gradation in the intention that provided from the teams. So it is also affect to what extent you can intervene yourself in evaluating the argument, and you have to acknowledge to what extent you can intervene, or you should, you know, to what extent you should interact the material to the others. That's why I think there is also the level of the proof in the intention. The first level, the lowest level, is that the meaning and intent of the explanation are difficult to understand, and it's impossible to evaluate the content itself without intervention. So, for example, like it is very difficult to understand the speech, like from the very basic part, like the volume of the voice, the way, the structure of the speech, etc., which makes it very difficult to understand the speech from the get-go. I think these are the type of the, how they, makes it difficult to grasp the intention that debaters have. The second level is that simply present the analysis without explanation on how it fits into the classes, and it's unclear how it should be evaluated, yet there are certain nuances that can be inferred. So its example is that they are just giving a explanation of which leads to limitation or framing consequently, but there is no explicit explanation from the teams how they want judges to credit that materials. So they at least judge have to assume like probably this material interact in this way, stuff like that. The third level is that although no explanation is provided, there are strategies that can be evaluated consequently, or explanation is clear but lacks positive nuances. So the example is that when they make the refutation to the opponent teams, they don't really the where they are trying to refute is very unclear. How they try to, how they try to respond, where they try to respond is unclear. This is a type of, this is a type of like unclearness in the intention. But also the another example is that although they're giving good extension, it is unclear how this extension will interact with the opening exchange, and it is unclear how they want to win by this explanation, uh, by how they want to win by this extension and that explanation was so rough. I think this type of explanation is the kind of like makes it difficult for judges to, you know, explicitly explicitly acknowledge that they are having this type of intention, but still have some nuance, like positive nuance that they want to do present argument. So this is the third level. The first level is that although there is no explicit explanation, intended direction can be inferred from the speech, or there are a few important and positive nuances that can be evaluated. For example, the way they can do is that OO said X, but we disagree with this because, or our extension is not relevant to context or characterization. This kind of like intention that they are having. These are the intention that they are having and stated in the speeches. The last level is that the highest level is that explicit and reasonable explanation is provided, and the key nuance of the analysis are fully and explicitly explained. So, for example, this directly clashes with the important premise of OO. If we disprove this, O's case would not stand because, etc. Or our extension does not depend on context or characterization of X, which caused a parallel debate in the opening half. I think the difference between fourth level and fifth level is that although they, both are trying to say like, we counter OOs, but the difference is where they counter the opening opposition. The highest level explain it challenges the premise of OO, and that can disprove the OO's case. Or they can also explain the fourth level is ended up showing this is not relevant to the context or characterization. But the highest level can explain because it's not relevant to context or characterization, and it is the parallel part of the opening half. And then this extension is very important because even though they have the parallel characterization, this extension will stand, stuff like that. So these are the difference, or these are the intention that the beta will run, and these are the framework that should see the extension or see the argument from the teams. If you insert too much in the intention, or if you intervene too much on the intention, probably it leads to teams thinking that this judge are biased, or this judge is charitable to the specific team. So it is important to know what is the intention that teams have, which and then so you can minimize the amount of intervention you will make for the intention that the betas have. So if one teams are able to give the highest level explanation on how they highest level of an intention, you can just credit in a way that they are trying to argue, like these are countering to the premise of OO and how I evaluate it, etc. But if there is no explanation from the teams to show the intention, you cannot intervene too much. You cannot being charitable too much to that specific team, and then explaining you cannot explain. This refutation is challenging to the opening opposition premise. This can interact in this way. This can potentially develop in this way. I think this can be seen as the intervention. So it is important to acknowledge, recognize the intention that teams have, and then work and then judge and adjudicate in a way that's how the debaters have the intention. So these are the part of the understanding arguments in the specific part of likelihood, exclusivity, impact, weighing, and intention. So it's kind of combination when they are proving the impact. When they are proving impact, and also this is the gradation in proving the impact. So the failure in one level or failure in one criteria doesn't automatically means we cannot credit the argument at all. It's more like they did to this extent, but they didn't go beyond that. So these are the what we have to recognize. So it's not kind of like discrediting a lot, but you can show that the what you can just focus on what teams are managed to prove, even if they are not the fifth level, they managed to prove to third level, and this is the contribution that team brought. And I think this type of concept is very important when understanding and evaluating the argument. So, briefly talking about the burden, because I think although there is some, although I've explained there is several level in the how we evaluate each criteria. It's also important to acknowledge it is also important to acknowledge the burden, which contribute to know to what extent we can impose the burden. So the first thing I want to say is that there is the type of the burden. There is absolute one and relative one. So the example is, let's take the example of the communal railing one. This house prefers the world where all children since their birth live in state learning nursery home with professional nursery teachers and apart from their parents. This kind of like communal railing motion. The government will probably learn children cannot choose where to be born, so it is important to provide equal environment. In that instances, the absolute burden is that why equal environment is important, but the relative evaluation is why it's more important than other potential benefit. For example, OP might say parental rights is important, or they might say community life is important, or they also might say there is potential benefit that children can get if they are separately grown. So this comparison is something more relative rather than absolute one for that argument. So there's two type of the explanation and two type of burden we have to take into consideration. The second thing is that act analysis on incentive or capacity, because even if like they said one thing, even if they show there is incentive, if there is no capacity, probably the thing will not happen because they don't have a capacity, though they have the incentive. So I think especially when evaluating based on the actor, it is important to acknowledge that there is a part of incentive and a part of the capacity. It depends on the cases, like if the incentive is the dominant or capacity is dominant, or both are equally important. But I think it is important to firstly recognize that there is incentive and capacity when we discuss about the discussed actors. So for example, let's take the same example of a communal railing. When government side when the both team try to argue this gonna be better environment for the children, I think the incentive can be, for example, parents can hide the problem, but it will be changed because there is scrutiny and risks when it revealed. So this type of incentive prevent to hiding the problem. Or they also can talk about, because the people around children don't want to take much of intervention towards the children, but comparatively there is a manual and it is standardized. And then probably the teacher will probably the people will get less salary if they fucked up. That's why they try to care about the environment for the children, to make sure that the children are in the good position, and then also which leads to the reputation of you. I think these are the difference in the incentive that actors have. But even if they are able to suggest that they have very good incentive, the incentive will be changed by the motions. If they don't have the capacity to do well, it doesn't prove that the environment for the children gonna be better off. So it is also important to explain the capacity. For example, if it's not communal reeling, because the all parents are beginners, so it is difficult to ensure the quality. But the communal reeling, because they have to go through, for example, qualification to taking care of children, or they have the more experiences than single parents, because that's why they have more capacity. Or they can also explain the parents just the parents are so busy in working and child caring, which leads to the mistakes. But in our side, the working is integrated, so like the nursing is working, so it's more less busy compared to the current situation, stuff like that. So this type of explanation on how they have the capacity can prove that because they have this type of intention and they have the capacity, they will do in a good way. They will try to make the better environment. I think these are also the combination between the incentive and the capacity. So when you assess and when you evaluate it, adjudicate the people's behavior, not only about the one specific aspect of incentive or capacity, but you have to acknowledge that it's happened combination by the incentive and capacity. So when you adjudicate, I think these perspective is important and part of the burden you have to care when you adjudicate the when you see the actors analysis from the teams. The last thing is that the burden stems from clashes, which I think they different from the each round. There is several things. The first thing is about the consensus. I think in some round, some characterization or some premises will be the shared one and having the consensus. So I think that the consensus part will not be that much very, very high burden or heavy burden that teams have to prove. Because even if they try to show the consensus part, because this is a consensus, it doesn't really benefit the teams. That's why I think the burden that requires to prove the consensus part is much less important in specific grounds. But if it is not consensus, you have to prove that part to be true. And I think these are the things that different from the rounds. So these are the burden stems from classes. Another thing is that the proof of the classes. So the example is like the class between which is important, children or parents. There is basically thing is that there is two classes or two scenarios, two actors, and then comparing which is more important. I think the proving that why specific one is more important is the burden come from the rounds, because it's different from the which actor or which scenario that teams provided. That's why I think this is the burden stems from the classes or stems from the rounds. The last thing is that priority within classes. So for example, it's kind of like which are more prior in that class. For example, when they try to argue children is more important, and if the children is important is the consensus, the thing is that which gov or up are better able to suggest how children gonna be happier or how children gonna be better off. So this is the burden happen within the classes, which did better improving it. So this is a bit different from the direct crash. This is a bit different between the comparison comparison between one class and one class, but it's kind of contention within the class. So there is the several burden or several classes happen in the rounds, even though it seems one. I think there is several. So it is also important to know that there is several type of the burdens, and then you can adjudicate not only one point of the burden or one low, unimportant part of the burden, but you have to figure out which is the most important burden in the debate and what type of the burden happening in that debate. So this is the burden I explained, and then so this depends on the round. Some are depends on the round and some are not depends on the round. So it is important to distinguish what burden are required in that round. So so far I explained how we can understand the arguments, how we can understand how we can assess the arguments. And I think this is the most important part of the BP judging, especially talking about the nature of BP judging is kind of contribution, how well they are able to prove the argument, how important the argument is, etc. So if you have the perspective onto the 5 points and able to, evaluating in that spectrum without going beyond of the burden or missing the some burden, I think these are the essential part of the BP judging, the understanding argument. So this is the very main part of my lecture. So let's go a bit more practical thing is about derivation and OA briefly. So onto the derivation, I think general thing is that I think this is the first thing is that comparison on one. So you cannot insert other teams in specific comparison. So when you explain OG and opening up OG and OO, you cannot bring closing government in opening comparison, nor see closing opposition into opening comparison. It is also same it is also same for other comparison. And if you bring other comparison, it's gonna be more complex. It is not very accurate. So you cannot, when derivation happen, you basically explain the one-on-one comparison for you'll explain one-on-one comparison. The second thing is about the summarize and evaluate. So some judges will just repeat the speeches of the speakers, like they said blah blah blah, and then they said blah blah blah, they said blah blah blah. I think this is the not very point of the derivation, because like the both chair and the panels listen to the same debate, same round, so basically the information they have is largely similar. What is the difference is that how they evaluate it, how they credit the argument, how they view the argument. So not citing the speech a lot, not repeating the speech a lot, but what is needed to explain in the deliberation is the evaluation of the argument, evaluation of the teams. So especially talking about from the perspective of the chair, the point of discussion gonna be where the evaluation is largely different, or where there is gonna be more, the most contentious part. So if you have the 3 panelists, and then 2 of them put CJ fourth and 1 of them put CJ first, probably the closing government is the part you have to acknowledge. You have to deal with, because the evaluation is very different. It's more prior or more sets more priority in the very close comparison of opening. So for example, OG and O is very close. Everyone agreed to be close. So you have to prioritize the difference in closing government, because it's more drastic difference in the evaluation of the closing government. So in that instance, this is some kind of like priority you have to make as a chair, because you have the time restriction, and you cannot discuss everything in an equal amount. And if you start from the consensus part or less contentious part, you cannot spend enough time to the very contentious part, which oftentimes take a time. So you have to sort the what is the point of discussion by listening to the call of the panelist. So this is the how chairs should do deliberation, should manage the discussion. The second thing is about also the time management. So because there's 6 comparisons in the BP debate, you cannot persist one comparison that to a very very long degree. So if even if it's like very drastic difference in the evaluation, like one or first and false, probably you have to take the time on that comparison. But you cannot infinitely discuss and infinitely have the deliberation. So you probably have to give up the closest comparison. I mean, like you have to vote for the closest comparison, and then use the more time onto the where the evaluation is drastically different. So this is the some kind of like time management, and I think as a chair you have to care about the time management, because you cannot it's also important part of the BP judging and BP deliberation. uh BP deliberation. So this is the way how as a chair you manage the deliberation. So the thing is time management and prepping the what is sorting the what is the point of the discussion and do it. So but in the comparison to this, as a panelist, is that very simple, being concise and being clear. So about the being concise, as I already explained, the chair have the time restriction, and not only the conversation to the one panel, but if they have the 2 panelists, they have to talk both to score them. So they want to listen as much opinion as possible from each judges within the time restriction. So you cannot, talk a lot, like, talking like 3 or 4 minutes by, yourself. You cannot talk for, 4 minutes for one team or one comparison. I think the chair want to, hear more opinion from others, or they might want to move to the other contention. So in order to be a very good panelist to judge as a wing, it is important to being concise about what you want to talk about, so you can like just wrap up your explanation within like 1 minute. And then it also helps chairs to manage the deliberation, which also improve your scores in the deliberation. The second thing is about being clear. So it basically means that even if you are very concise, it is difficult to understand if we cannot get your point. So, for example, you can clearly state, I think they are winning in the likelihood because blah blah blah. For example, if you are asked the question by the chair, you can just say, I agree with the perspective, or I disagree with this perspective because, etc. So you can just cite the conclusion first to make sure that chair have the understanding on what you're trying to say. So this is being clear is the one of the very very important important things that you have to care as a panelist in order for chairs to clearly and correctly represent your thought. So these are the deliberation as in general as a chair and panel. So the basic thing is that not repeat, very concise and very clear, and try to do within the time restriction, being conscious about the time restriction. So these are the deliberation. So lastly, onto the OA. I will just go very briefly because I think the OA is not. I think the people have the different style in the OA, and it's not very unified type of OA. But the things that I can say, which I think they happen in common, is the first thing is the importance, and the second thing is about the level of evaluation. So first thing is about importance. So because OA also have the time restriction, you cannot touch every single materials, and you cannot explain to same degree for all arguments. That's why you have to make the priority in arguments, in the classes. So the thing is, you can prioritize contentious parts, for example, contentious premise, characterization, value judgment, etc., which oftentimes matters a lot to win or loss. So, the point is that, for example, if the all arguments are based on the characterization, like the extent of the impact are based on the characterization, you have to explain the characterization first, and you have to explain the characterization in detail compared to how you evaluate the rest of the argument part. So these are the priority you can make in terms of like importance. The second thing is that level of evaluation. As I already explained, evaluation is not black and white. There is a gradation. It's not about if one thing is a lack, it doesn't mean the argument are not completely proven. So what you have to acknowledge is that teams managed to prove something, and you have to take in account that the where like to what extent the teams are able to prove. So I think the common things that happen, or common thing I see in the feedback, is that judge is not very punitive. They don't collect our argument even though we have like some explanation. So these are the type that can be solved by the acknowledging that there is a gradation in the impacting gradation in arguments, because if if there is any explanation, then you can think that it is the first level or second level, and you just not say that it is completely unproven, but you can explain they prove to the extent blah blah blah, but this is not sufficient because blah blah blah. I think these are more nuanced and detailed understanding towards what teams try to intend to prove. So I think that having the level and gradation in evaluation in a way is very important. So basically, in summary, uh, when you're making the OA, what you can be mindful is that what would you want to hear when you are a debater? Because like the debaters will see the round from the perspective of that teams. You will see the OA, or you will see the rounds in the OG's perspective, O's perspective, C's perspective, etc. And people have some biases on what if this argument credited, how this are how this evaluated, etc. So you can be mindful on what debaters intended to do in that round, what you want to hear if you are the debater in that round. I think this is something that part you can be mindful when when making the OAs. So alright, these are the all contents of today's lecture. If you do have, is there anyone who have a question? You can feel free to ask me. I'll stay around. Oh yeah. I,
Yeah, hi. I have a few questions. I'll
mhm.
just ask them and then you can like respond in order. So number one, if there are two benches, let's say OG, OO, CCG, CO, like all these benches are there, and OG gives a particular argument to which OO gives a rebuttal. And now CO comes out and says that we agree with OO on this rebuttal and we think this beats OG. Then in this comparison, does CO beat OG or not? This is the first question.
Oh wait,
Second question.
can I so the again the OG provided argument or rebut to the OG's case, and then CG uh
No, no. Then CO says that we agree with OO's rebuttal, and this is why we win over OG.
CG agree with the O's refutation, and then they argue that CO are also winning over OG.
Then do I credit that rebuttal to CO or not?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's the
So
first question.
mhm, the first question.
Then the second question is, on your whole part of understanding arguments, you tell me there's multiple levels to an argument, right? Like likelihood, exclusivity, and stuff like that. If a team points out to me that their argument is more likely, and the other team points out to me that even though their argument is a little less likely, it's still having an impact that's way severe as compared to the other side. Now, out of these metrics, which metric do I judge to be more important, considering that there's no extra analysis given on which of these metrics is more important in the round?
Okay, thank you so much. So on to the first
Uh,
question. Mhm.
I'm sorry, just one more thing. On frames or like premise, as you call it, considering that the frames change in the round, let's say OG comes out and tell me that people are inherently violent, then OO says that people are not inherently violent, people are inherently gentle. Now, and let's say CG agrees with OG's frame and CEO agrees with OO's frame. Now, while comparing OG and CG and OG and OO, which of these frames do I consider to be more important? And let's say I consider OO's frame to be more like likely, or I compare the OG versus OO clash on OO's frame. Now, do I compare OG versus CG clash also on that frame or on the frame that is agreed upon by OG and CG both? That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So first, about the first question, basically, I think even if closing opposition agree to the O's refutation, it doesn't mean the CEO can win over opening up government on that material. It's different if they have any other different extension, because I think basically the contribution on, the that limitation is contribution from opening opposition. And then if closing opposition cannot add any value onto that refutation, it doesn't mean that it can be a closing opposition's contribution. Because I think logic or material is coming from OO and not from the closing opposition. So closing opposition cannot win solely by just agreeing to the refutation to the opening government. Does that make sense? Okay, so on to the second things. Second question about the uh yeah, less likelihood but having impact, and how would you compare it? So the first thing is that if there is any weighing in explaining that which impact is which metric is more important, you can just credit it. If both team brought each metric, you can compare which metric are more proven to be important. But if there is no metric provided from neither team, you can explain. It's based on the rounds, but the way you can explain is firstly, I prioritize likelihood because impact will not happen if it's less likely, and then if given that the likelihood is some extent proven, like it's reasonably happen, then the impact is likely to happen even though it is small. It's going to be more certain. The second way of explanation is that we prioritize the impact team because at least that the teams are able to show that there is some likelihood happening, and then it's not the absolutely zero or it's close to the zero. That's why I think the explanation of the impact is important. So these two type of the explanation are possible when there is no metric coming from them. In that instances, I think this based on the how the rounds goes, because the I think the OA also have the brief burden, like which are more easier to explain, which is more easier to compare, convince the debaters. So it's based on the rounds, how it's interact with the other teams, how the rounds dynamics looks like, and then this is how you can decide which metric to prioritize. Does that make sense? Okay, and then last thing is about the comparison on the framings. So the first priority is that if there is any consensus in the framing, so if there is specific teams agreeing on the people are violent, you will compare on that metric. If there is consensus, you will compare in that metric. If there is no comparison, uh, if there is no comparison between no consensus in the framing, you will compare which is more plausible characterization, like based on the logic or intuition provided from the teams. So it's basically similar to the second question on which metric will be prioritized. It's based on the rounds. It's based on the level of explanation from teams. So it's like more should be more detailed, taking the nuance of the each teams how they proved the part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just one thing.
Mhm.
Considering this, right now, let's say OG and OO are disagreeing on the frame, and OG and CG are agreeing on the frames. Now, if I take OO's frame to be more plausible as compared to OG's, then obviously in the OG versus OO clash, I judge that clash on the basis of OO's frame. But considering that now I take that frame to be more plausible, do I use that frame only for OG versus CG, or do I use the consensus frame only, considering that there was like consensus, right? Because then I'm using different frames for different clashes.
So you mean like OG and OO have different frame, and then CG agree to OO's frame, and then the
No, no,
question
CG agrees to OG's frame.
CG agrees to the OG's frame, and then comparison between OG and CG and OO and CG.
Yeah.
Mhm. So comparison between OG CG will be the metric they have the consensus, I guess. The first thing is that metric, yeah, because they are also they have set the goal into the same things. Uh, so it's basically compare within that frame. So like if they have the different impact based on this characterization, then like it's just comparison between the that which impact is more important. So I think if they have the same frame, their same consensus, I think they will judge based on it. When it comes to the OCG's comparison, so it's kinda which side are able to give the reason which framing is more reasonable. If you think the O's framing is more reasonable and that framing can mitigate the CZ's argument to a reasonable degree, you can give win to the opening option.
All right. So then using different frames within the same debate for different clashes is like okay, right? It's like an accepted practice.
Yeah. But you cannot be
Yeah, that's
so
all.
inconsistent between the OG and CG. So so like it's basically you can try to use the so when you compare OG and OO and CG and OO, you cannot change the evaluation for the opening option. So it is okay to compare with the different frame on the OG OO and CG OO, but you cannot change the evaluation of OO during the OA or evaluation. So you cannot say, um, yeah. So you should be consistent in the evaluation of the teams, but how it interact with the teams is kinda different.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. And Rochelle? Mm-hmm. So if I cannot come up with the different impacts and then try to give the unique analysis, uh, I mean, like you mean like how effective it is. Mhm. So I think if it's new from opening, I think this will be count as extension as well. So the question goes to the comparison between which whether opening and closing, which side better, which impact is more plausibly proven, which mechanism is more plausible. Especially talking about the OG have, if the opening have the decent mechanization which likely to happen, you need the positive material on why your materials is more important than opening government. So for example, is that the certainty, or is that more charitable to the op characterization, uh, or it's more the likely demographics, anything is fine. I think if you can add the any value to a reasonable extent, I think this is gonna be the one of the strategy to win from the closing. But I think it's also same thing can say to the opening teams. So if opening teams are able to suggest this characterization is majority of the rounds, this is very likely, and if there is no room to challenge, or if it is difficult to suggest your priority to the opening, I think you might difficult to win over opening, but still you are able to win to the opponent teams. So you can, if you are able to weight up the impact or mechanization to opponent teams, like if you're like a closing government, you can use your extension into you can use extension to compare with the OO and CO. That can reason to beat up the bench even if you cannot take down opening government. Does that answer to your question? Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Nachikesh.
Yep, hello. I had two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is on contributions. It's something what can I actually credit as a contribution? Suppose there's two explanations. Let's say OG says that AI destroys democracy or something to a certain level, and they're closing. CG comes in and says, here's exactly why it happens and under what conditions this is happening at all points. There's no new impact being achieved. So, can a deeper explanation or any new comparative analysis itself can it contribute to an additional contribution that I can go ahead and credit, or any contribution does it need to involve, let's say, substantially new matter always? That's my question on contributions. Secondly, I think it's mostly about how do I credit an argument if it hasn't hit an assumption inside it. Let's say a team within the debate, they identify and disprove an assumption that is underlying an argument that a certain bench is running. How much credit should I, as a judge, go ahead and give to it compared to directly refuting the conclusion of the argument in itself? Because if an argument is intuitive that a certain bench is making, but it's not explained to the fullest extent, should I go ahead and infer whatever missing mechanism is there from whatever common knowledge I have as an OIV, or should I only evaluate from what was explicitly proven by the certain bench?
Okay. So on to the first question about the contribution. I think any new material can be the contribution, right? Especially talking about extension. The question is, I think the degree of the contribution or amount of a contribution is different. So if the closing cannot give any new impact and probably addition of the one or two mechanization, still I think this one or two mechanization account as a contribution from closing government. But I think the degree of the contribution is very small. I think this is something that's how I think the contribution is. So it not necessarily be the substantially new contribution. Sometimes they can win by adding the very very strong mechanization from closing government, even though it is not, very substantive part and kind of like very mechanistic things. So this is uh kind of like what is this is kind of scope of the contribution. The second thing is about the by the way, the first question, did it answer your question?
Yes, it is. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
And then as for the second question, so uh as for the way you can do is that if the argument you know if the argument itself as absolute evaluation, there's no sufficient explanation, and obviously there is the logical gaps. You can just point out as a general things like, for example, uh, you know, this part is not proven. But if you think that there is the reasonable linkage, you can credit to the extent they are able to suggest the scenarios like that. And then when there is a refutation, it's with the way when it interact with the that's material. So the refutation. So I think that when you credit refutation more, I think the refutation is like some kind of like having the mechanization or new characterization. So you can just explain opening government, for example, like government suggested the possibility of this happening, but the analysis coming from op are able to suggest the op case is majority of the cases and the gov is not, minor cases, things like that. So I think this oftentimes happen, the bench compares, teams comparison and general, general point out kind of combination. But if there's many general point out, like this is all IB knowledge or this is not proven, I think this seems a bit unfair. So you can be mindful about if there is any, extent that teams can prove, and then you can compare with that, material that they are able to prove to some degree, and then the responses are coming from them, and compare which are more plausible. That Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you so much. Is there any other question? I guess.
Excuse me.
Mhm,
One thing on intention, because
mhm.
actually I've never like heard this before when I like learned, I think so probably like really informative for me. Considering that the team gives me complete analysis, just throws it out there that this happens, but they don't tell me why it's relevant to the clash and how it interacts with the other benches. Am I supposed to take that analysis and compare that myself to the full extent, or is that like or is that like considered intervention or inserting yourself? Because I didn't quite understand that distinction. Like, am I allowed to insert myself on every analysis that they give me, or am I not allowed unless they tell me that this is how it interacts with the other benches?
Hmm. So the basic thing is that if there is absolutely no explanation, you can insert yourself, but you cannot strongly take that stances. So uh, I mean like if it's, you cannot, when you insert yourself, you can do only in the reasonable, reasonable extent. So if, for example, if they talk about this is a refutation to OO, and there is no specificity in explaining that what is the where that they are trying to refute, but still you can credit as a refutation to OO. So like, this is something that's refute to this part of opening operation. Probably this can be allowed, but you cannot explain this part of the analysis are counteracting to the O's this part of the mechanization, and this also deconstruct the, the in the these disprove the likelihood of all the cases, etc., etc. You cannot be that much specific and that much of the detailed parts, because um it's kind of like very charitable to that teams if it's go beyond the intention that much. So the the conclusion is, you are, if there is no, absolutely nothing, you can insert yourself, but you should remain to a reasonable extent. You cannot very specific, and you cannot create the rounds or create the intention on behalf of them. If there is any implicit way of explanation, you can just follow to it. So
Okay.
you cannot, just so you cannot be creative.
Okay. So basically, if they tell me that this refutes OO's point, I can insert myself to the point to tell which point it refutes, but I can't really like scale it as much as I like want to.
Yeah. Just in a reasonable field, reasonable extent.
Okay. Now, suppose that OO gives me a rebuttal or something, some material or refutation to a case, such that that refutation directly rebuts OG's case, and they tell me that this rebuts OG's case. However, now CG comes and gives me a case that, in a different sense, is also subject to the same, even though it's a different case, it's subject to the same refutation that OO has already given me. Now in OO versus CG clash, do I consider that to refute CG, considering that they did not tell me that this refutes CG? But it does actually refute CG if you think about it. And considering that OO, of course, had no way of knowing that it will also refute CG. Do I give this rebuttal or do I not credit it?
I think that we can credit to the opening opposition because I think I mean, I think the OO just gives the implicit refutation, like implicit preemption to the closing government, and especially opening opposition cannot refute to the closing government. So if it's like for example, uh if closing government have the similar problem of the opening government, like when opening opposition question opening government in terms like livelihood, by giving the characterization of the specific actor, and the CZ wasn't able to answer that's the characterization, and then just they go through the arguments, then it means like probably opening opposition and pushing that characterization is something important in the rounds, so you can just take it into the account for the opening opposition. Uh, yeah. So if you credit opening opposition in the opening comparison, which means that that contribution is for the opening opposition. So that contribution still remains in OOCG's comparison because the contribution is something that's, credit for that teams and not kind of discredit.
Cool. That's fine. Now, if the roles were exactly reversed, CG rebuts OG with some rebuttal, and they tell me that this is a response to, or this is a refutation to OG's case, but they don't say that this is a refutation to OO's case, despite the fact that it actually is a refutation to OO's case as well. They just don't mention that intention to me. Now, considering that they also had the chance, because in the previous comparison, OO did not have the chance, right? Here, CG had the chance to refute OO or tell me that their intention is also to refute OO, but they don't do that. Now, do I consider that refutation for OO or do I just not credit that because they had the chance and did not tell me that intent?
Wait, what the situation is? CC rebutting to the
Yeah. I'll repeat once again. CG rebuts opening government
Mhm.
with a proper refutation, and they tell me that their intention of this refutation is that we take over OG because the OG's case does not work because, and then they give the refutation. However, I, as a judge, know on the top floor of the debate that this refutation also refutes OO's case. However, CG has not said that this refutation also applies to OO's case, which means they have not showed to me the intention of this refuting OO's case as well. Now, do I refute OO's case using the same refutation that they have mentioned but have not given the intention to me
Mhm.
and give CG over OO, or do I not credit that, considering that they had the chance to say that but did not give me that intention?
So the first thing is that probably the scenario is not that likely, given that the refutation, direct refutation to the opening team is count as a knifing. So I'm not sure the exact situation is. So if the CZ's refutation is clearly contradict with the opening government, you cannot credit that materials because it's knifing. So it doesn't count as a contribution for the closing government. So it means that even in the OOCZ comparison, that CZ refutation or CZ's analysis cannot, cannot, take over opening opposition by this reason. But it's kind even if it's kind of like uh doubt to the opening team. Hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed that point of like not being able to knife. Just switch the scenario to, let's say CU is rebutting CG with a refutation, but it also refutes OG and they don't tell me that it refutes OG. Like, let's just change so
Ah,
that knifing does not play a role here.
mhm. So in that case, um, probably it's like kind of depends on the rounds because I think that sometimes that the refutation has the nuance to counter to the opening comment as well. Uh, so if they are pointing out the very similar problem, it is unlikely to just very no intention to the opening comment and no nuance to the opening comment. So if there is any nuances, you can have you can credit to you can cite that refutation to the OGC comparison, but you cannot be very specifically talking, very specific about uh these materials is interact with in this way, this way, this way. If the OGs and CZ material are kind of different, so for example, if they are learning the very different impacts with very different mechanization, if closing opposition give the refutation, probably it doesn't, and then they don't have any intention to attack opening government. I think it's not reasonable to give that much of credit to the closing opposition in the OGCU comparison. But if there is a similarity between the OGs and CGs cases, and CEO refute to this closing government in that similarity part, that probably includes some level of intention or nuance towards the opening government, so you can take it into the consideration towards uh, opening government and CU comparison. But I think this basically based on how they explain the argument and how explain the refutation or the dynamics of the argument, dynamics of the rounds. So it's basically that depends on the rounds, like how the I mean, like how exactly they prove their argument or how exactly they land the cases. But I think the kind of vibes is what I explained now. Yeah, hope this makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot for the workshop. It was super informative as well.
Nice. Uh, it, I will stay like 3 minutes more here. So if you have any further question, you can ask. If not, you can leave as well. Thank you so much for coming.